My beloved child, don't skip. Listen carefully, because this fictional story begins on a night when one difficult decision feels close enough to change everything. Stay until the very end, because what starts as fear of goodbye slowly becomes a journey of honesty, courage, and understanding. This is not a prediction about your life or your future. It is an inspirational story about communication, personal growth, and the importance of speaking truthfully before silence creates distance. For many months, the person in this story had been carrying emotions they struggled to express. They smiled during conversations, answered messages politely, and continued moving through daily life as if everything were fine. But deep inside, they felt exhausted by misunderstandings, unanswered questions, and the weight of words that had never been spoken. One evening, after another long day of pretending they were not hurting, they sat alone and wondered whether walking away completely would be easier than continuing to carry the uncertainty. The thought frightened them, yet it also revealed how deeply they had been struggling. Listen carefully, because this is where the story begins to change. Instead of making a sudden decision, they chose to pause and reflect. They realized that saying goodbye without first speaking honestly would leave too many questions unanswered. They thought about every meaningful moment, every lesson learned through difficult seasons, and every opportunity they had missed to communicate openly. For the first time in a long while, they admitted that what they truly wanted was not escape, it was clarity. That realization became the turning point that transformed fear into courage. Meanwhile, the other person in this fictional story was also sensing that something had changed. They noticed the growing distance, the shorter conversations, and the quiet sadness that seemed to appear between ordinary moments. Instead of ignoring it, they began reflecting on their own actions. They asked themselves whether they had listened carefully enough, shown enough patience, or expressed enough appreciation. They understood that meaningful relationships require effort from both people and that unspoken feelings can slowly create walls where trust once lived. Don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of the story unfolds here. One quiet evening, they finally chose to have the conversation they had both been avoiding. There were no dramatic speeches or perfect words. There was honesty. They spoke about their fears, their frustrations, and the ways silence had made each of them feel alone. They listened without interrupting. They acknowledged mistakes without becoming defensive. For the first time in months, both of them felt understood. The conversation did not magically solve every problem, but it replaced confusion with clarity and distance with compassion. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story carries an important lesson. Sometimes the fear of losing someone forever is not a sign that the story must end. Sometimes it is a reminder that honest communication can no longer be postponed. Relationships are not strengthened by pretending everything is fine. They grow stronger when people choose truth over avoidance, understanding over assumptions, and patience over pride. Every difficult conversation becomes an opportunity to rebuild trust, deepen respect, and create a healthier future together. As dawn began to brighten the horizon, both people realized that the most important choice. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the conversation that almost never happened became the moment that changed everything. Listen carefully, because after that night, neither person could return to pretending that everything was fine. The silence they had lived with for so long had finally been broken, and although the truth was difficult to hear, it brought a sense of relief neither of them expected. They realized that fear had been writing their story for far too long. Every misunderstanding had grown larger simply because neither heart knew how to speak openly. Now, for the first time, they chose honesty over assumptions, courage over avoidance, and compassion over pride. That single decision opened the door to healing that once seemed impossible. The days that followed were different. They did not suddenly become perfect, nor did every question disappear overnight. Instead, each morning became another opportunity to rebuild what had been weakened. They learned that trust is not restored through one emotional conversation but through consistent actions repeated every day. A returned phone call. A sincere apology. A promise carefully kept. A willingness to listen without preparing a response. Those ordinary moments slowly became extraordinary because they proved that real change was taking place. They discovered that relationships are strengthened not by dramatic declarations but by faithful choices made when no one else is watching. Meanwhile, both people continued reflecting on everything they had learned. They understood that they had spent too much time expecting the other person to read unspoken thoughts and hidden emotions. They realized that love cannot flourish where communication disappears. Respect cannot grow where assumptions replace honest conversations. Hope cannot survive where fear is allowed to speak louder than truth. These realizations were not easy to accept, but they became the foundation for a healthier future. Every difficult lesson became another reason to value openness, patience, and understanding. Don't skip this part, because the emotional turning point quietly arrives here. One peaceful evening, while watching the sunset paint the sky with shades of gold and crimson, they looked back on the moment when they had almost walked away forever. They realized that if they had chosen silence instead of honesty, they would have carried unanswered questions for the rest of their lives. Instead, they had chosen the more difficult path, the path of vulnerability, accountability, and sincere communication. It required courage, but it also brought peace. They no longer feared difficult conversations because they understood that truth spoken with kindness has the power to heal what silence often damages. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its deepest lessons. Sometimes the greatest victory is not convincing someone to stay. It is creating a relationship where both people feel safe enough to speak honestly, admit mistakes, ask forgiveness, and continue growing together. Lasting connections are never built on perfection. They are built on humility, trust, consistency, and the willingness to choose one another again and again through every changing season of life. Those quiet daily choices became stronger than fear had ever been. As another sunrise filled the horizon with warm light, both people stepped into a brand new day carrying hope instead of uncertainty. They understood that the future would still contain challenges, but they no longer viewed those challenges as reasons to give up. Instead, they saw them as opportunities to practice patience, strengthen trust, and deepen mutual respect. Every new day became another chance to write a better chapter than the one before. And as they continued walking forward together in this fictional story, they discovered that what had once seemed like the end had quietly become the beginning of something wiser, healthier, and far more meaningful than either of them had imagined. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, dawn brought more than a new day, it brought a new perspective. Listen carefully, because after the conversation they had feared for so long, neither person woke up believing every problem had disappeared. Instead, they woke with something even more valuable, the willingness to keep choosing honesty. They understood that healing is rarely instant. It grows slowly through patient conversations, consistent actions, and the courage to remain present even when emotions feel overwhelming. What had almost become a permanent goodbye was now becoming an opportunity to rebuild trust one day at a time. As the days passed, they began noticing small changes that once would have gone unnoticed. A message sent simply to ask how the other person was doing. A conversation that lasted a little longer than usual. A sincere apology offered without excuses. A quiet promise followed by faithful action instead of empty words. These moments seemed ordinary to everyone else, but to them they represented something extraordinary. They proved that lasting change is not created by dramatic speeches but by daily decisions to care, to listen, and to understand. Every act of patience became another stone placed in the foundation they were rebuilding together. Meanwhile, both people spent time reflecting on the mistakes that had almost led them to walk away forever. They realized that neither of them had intended to cause pain. Much of the distance had grown through misunderstandings, assumptions, and fears left unspoken. They learned that silence often allows small problems to become much larger than they truly are. From that realization came a new commitment. They would no longer assume they understood each other's hearts without asking. They would no longer allow pride to delay necessary conversations. Instead, they chose openness, humility, and respect, believing those qualities would guide them through whatever challenges still lay ahead. Don't skip this part, because the emotional turning point of this fictional story quietly unfolds beneath an ordinary evening sky. While sitting together in peaceful silence, they realized something remarkable. They no longer felt the need to fill every moment with words. The silence between them no longer represented distance. It represented comfort. Trust had begun returning, not because life had become perfect, but because both people had decided to protect the connection with honesty rather than fear. That quiet realization filled their hearts with gratitude and reminded them that meaningful relationships are strengthened through countless small moments that often go unnoticed. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares one of its most important lessons. Every relationship will experience seasons of uncertainty. Every heart will sometimes struggle to find the right words. But those seasons do not have to become permanent endings. When people are willing to listen carefully, speak truthfully, forgive sincerely, and grow together, even the most difficult chapters can become the beginning of something stronger than before. Real commitment is not about never facing challenges. It is about facing those challenges with kindness, patience, and unwavering respect for one another. As another sunrise painted the horizon with brilliant shades of gold, both people stepped into the new day carrying hope instead of fear. They no longer focused on what might have happened if they had remained silent forever. Instead, they celebrated the courage that had allowed them to choose conversation over avoidance and understanding over assumption. Every new morning became another invitation to build a healthier future together, one filled with trust, gratitude, compassion, and steady growth. And as they continued walking forward through this fictional story, they quietly realized that the goodbye they had feared most had transformed into a new beginning, reminding them that hope often arrives the moment we choose courage over silence. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the choice they made at sunrise became the turning point that neither of them could have imagined. Listen carefully, because as the first light spread across the sky, both of them quietly realized that love cannot survive on assumptions alone. It must be protected by honesty, patience, and the courage to keep showing up even when conversations become uncomfortable. They looked at the road behind them and saw how close they had come to letting fear write the final chapter. But instead of allowing silence to become the ending, they chose something far more difficult. They chose to stay, to listen, and to grow. That decision did not erase every wound, but it opened the door for healing to begin. The days that followed were filled with ordinary moments that slowly carried extraordinary meaning. They laughed again without pretending everything was perfect. They spoke openly about the pain they had hidden for months. They admitted where pride had stood in the way of understanding. There were moments when old fears tried to return, whispering that nothing had really changed, but every time those fears appeared, they answered them with another honest conversation instead of another painful silence. Little by little, the walls that had once divided them began to fall, replaced by trust that was being rebuilt through consistent actions rather than emotional promises. Meanwhile, both people discovered something they had never fully understood before. They had spent so much energy worrying about losing each other that they had forgotten to appreciate the gift of simply being present. They began celebrating the small victories. A peaceful morning conversation, a shared smile after a difficult day, a message sent just to encourage one another, and the quiet comfort of knowing someone was willing to stay through life's uncertain seasons. Those simple moments became priceless because they reminded them that meaningful relationships are not sustained by dramatic events but by daily acts of kindness, respect, and unwavering commitment. Don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story now begins revealing itself. One evening, while watching the sunset disappear beyond the horizon, they reflected on how different life might have been if fear had won. They realized they would have carried unanswered questions for years, wondering what might have happened if they had simply spoken honestly. Instead, they now carried something much more valuable: peace. Not because every challenge had disappeared, but because they had finally stopped running from difficult conversations. They had learned that truth spoken gently creates understanding, while silence often creates confusion. That lesson became one of the greatest gifts their journey had given them. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reaches one of its deepest realizations. The goodbye they feared was never truly about leaving another person behind. It was about leaving behind old habits that no longer served them. They said goodbye to pride that refused to apologize. They said goodbye to fear that prevented vulnerability. They said goodbye to assumptions that replaced honest communication. And as those burdens disappeared, they found room for something new to grow: greater patience, deeper compassion, stronger trust, and a friendship capable of weathering every changing season of life. As another sunrise painted the sky with brilliant shades of gold, hope quietly settled into their hearts. They understood that no relationship is strengthened by perfection. It is strengthened by people who are willing to learn, forgive, adapt, and keep choosing one another through every challenge life places before them. They stepped into the new day carrying gratitude instead of regret, wisdom instead of fear, and courage instead of uncertainty. The future remained unwritten, but that no longer frightened them. It inspired them, because they knew every new chapter would be written not by panic or silence, but by faithful choices made with honesty, compassion, and love. My beloved child, don't skip these final words, because they lead directly into the next chapter. Sometimes the moment that looks like the end is quietly becoming a new beginning. Sometimes the hardest conversation becomes the strongest foundation. Sometimes the fear of goodbye becomes the reason two people finally discover the value of truth. And as they continued walking side by side into the light of a brand new day, they realized that the greatest miracle was never avoiding the storm, it was learning how to walk through it together with hope, integrity, and hearts that refuse to give up. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, what happened next was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and life-changing. Listen carefully, because the strongest turning points rarely arrive with grand announcements. They appear in ordinary moments when someone decides to stop letting fear make every decision. As another morning began, both people awoke with a different mindset. They were no longer asking whether the future would be perfect. Instead, they asked themselves how they could bring more honesty, patience, and kindness into the present. That simple change in perspective transformed everything. The future no longer felt like something to fear. It became something they could prepare for, one thoughtful choice at a time. The weeks that followed became a season of rebuilding. Every conversation carried more openness than before. Every misunderstanding was met with questions instead of assumptions. Every disagreement became an opportunity to understand rather than to win. They slowly realized that the connection they were protecting had become stronger precisely because it had survived difficult moments. Challenges no longer appeared as signs that everything was falling apart. Instead, they became reminders that healthy relationships grow stronger when both people are willing to face problems together instead of facing each other. That realization filled their hearts with quiet confidence. Meanwhile, the people around them began noticing the difference. Friends commented on the calmness in their voices. Family members noticed that they smiled more often and worried less about things beyond their control. They carried themselves with a peaceful confidence that did not depend on having perfect circumstances. Their joy came from knowing they had chosen integrity over pride, communication over silence, and understanding over judgment. Without realizing it, their personal growth began encouraging others to reflect on their own relationships and priorities. Their story became a reminder that lasting change often begins within a single heart before it ever becomes visible to the world. Don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this chapter unfolds during an ordinary afternoon. Sitting beneath the shade of an old tree, they reflected on the journey that had brought them here. They remembered the nights when fear almost convinced them to walk away forever. They remembered the unanswered messages, the difficult conversations, and the uncertainty that once seemed impossible to overcome. Looking back, they no longer viewed those memories with sadness. They viewed them with gratitude. Every difficult chapter had become a teacher. Every setback had strengthened patience. Every disappointment had refined their character. They finally understood that even painful seasons can prepare us for beautiful beginnings if we allow them to shape us with wisdom rather than bitterness. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares one of its greatest truths. Real love is not measured by how loudly someone speaks or how dramatic a single moment becomes. It is measured by the countless quiet decisions made every day to listen carefully, to forgive sincerely, to remain faithful to promises, to speak with respect, and to continue choosing compassion even when life becomes complicated. Those ordinary choices became the invisible threads holding their connection together. They realized that trust is built slowly, strengthened consistently, and protected intentionally through every season. As evening arrived and the first stars appeared across the peaceful sky, both people smiled with grateful hearts. They no longer feared the words, "goodbye," because they had learned that the most important farewell was the one they had already spoken to fear, to pride, and to silence. Those burdens no longer controlled their journey. In their place stood hope, humility, resilience, and a deeper appreciation for every ordinary day they were given. The road ahead remained filled with mystery, yet they welcomed it with confidence because they knew they would face it with honesty, courage, and mutual respect. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because they prepare the way for the final chapter of this fictional story. Every sunrise now reminded them that new beginnings are possible. Every challenge reminded them that growth is always within reach. Every conversation reminded them that understanding is worth the effort. And as they continued walking toward tomorrow, hand in hand with renewed purpose, they realized that the greatest gift life had given them was not the absence of difficulty, it was the wisdom to face every difficulty with hearts that had learned to love with patience, integrity, compassion, and enduring hope. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story the journey has reached the moment where every lesson begins coming together. Listen carefully, because after everything they had experienced, both people understood that the greatest battles had never been against each other. The real battle had always been against fear, pride, doubt, and the silence that had slowly built walls between their hearts. Now those walls were beginning to disappear. They no longer saw one another through the pain of old misunderstandings. Instead, they chose to see each other through the wisdom they had gained. Every difficult season had changed them. Every unanswered question had taught patience. Every disappointment had quietly shaped them into people who valued honesty more than comfort and understanding more than being right. As another peaceful morning arrived, they found themselves smiling over the smallest moments that once seemed unimportant. Sharing breakfast without rushing. Laughing over old memories. Taking long walks without needing to fill every silence with words. They discovered that true peace does not always arrive through extraordinary events. Sometimes it grows quietly through ordinary days lived with gratitude. The connection they were rebuilding became stronger because it was no longer built on unrealistic expectations. It rested on something much deeper: mutual respect, open communication, forgiveness, and the willingness to keep learning from one another. Every ordinary day became another reminder that the strongest foundations are built slowly. Meanwhile, people who knew them noticed something remarkable. The tension that had once surrounded them had disappeared. Their conversations reflected patience instead of frustration. Their decisions reflected wisdom instead of impulse. They no longer reacted to every misunderstanding with fear. Instead, they paused, listened, and sought understanding before responding. That quiet maturity inspired others around them. Friends who had struggled in their own relationships began asking thoughtful questions. Family members saw the value of kindness expressed through consistent actions rather than dramatic promises. Without realizing it, their journey had become an example of how personal growth can influence everyone nearby. Don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this chapter arrives during one unforgettable evening. Sitting beneath a sky filled with countless stars, they reflected on the path behind them. They remembered the day they almost allowed fear to become their final chapter. They remembered how easy it would have been to walk away without another conversation. Yet they also remembered the courage it took to stay, to speak honestly, to apologize where necessary, and to forgive where healing was possible. Looking back, they realized that the greatest victory had never been winning an argument or proving a point. Their greatest victory was refusing to let fear have the final word. That realization filled them with a peace deeper than they had ever imagined. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares one of its most enduring lessons. Every meaningful relationship requires two people who are willing to keep growing long after the excitement of the beginning has passed. It requires humility strong enough to admit mistakes, patience steady enough to endure difficult seasons, and compassion generous enough to forgive imperfections. They learned that love is not a destination reached once and forgotten. It is a daily choice renewed through every conversation, every act of kindness, every promise kept, and every moment when understanding is chosen over pride. Those quiet decisions became the greatest treasures they possessed. As another sunrise spread golden light across the horizon, they welcomed the day with hearts free from the burdens they once carried. Fear no longer controlled their decisions. Regret no longer defined their memories. Uncertainty no longer stole their peace. They stepped confidently into the future, understanding that while life would continue bringing unexpected challenges, it would also continue offering opportunities to grow wiser, kinder, and more grateful. Every new day became another invitation to build a future marked by trust, integrity, and hope. They no longer worried about whether tomorrow would be perfect. They simply committed themselves to making today's choices with love and sincerity. My beloved child, don't skip these final words of this chapter, because the story is approaching its beautiful conclusion. The goodbye they once feared had quietly transformed into a goodbye to everything that had kept them apart. They had left behind resentment, silence, pride, and fear. In their place remained courage, forgiveness, honesty, patience, and enduring hope. And as they continued walking together beneath the bright morning sky, they realized that the greatest chapters of their fictional journey had never been about avoiding hardship, they had always been about discovering that hearts willing to grow can turn even the darkest seasons into the beginning of something truly beautiful. My beloved child, don't skip these final words, because every chapter of this fictional story has been leading to this moment. Listen carefully, because what once seemed like the end was never truly the end at all. The goodbye that had caused so much fear became the beginning of something far greater than either person could have imagined. They finally understood that the hardest battles had never been against each other. They had been against fear, pride, misunderstanding, and the silence that kept two honest hearts from speaking openly. Once those walls came down, hope quietly took their place, and what seemed impossible slowly became possible again. As the seasons passed, they looked back on everything they had endured together. They remembered the sleepless nights, the unanswered questions, the moments when giving up felt easier than trying again, and the conversations that required more courage than either of them thought they possessed. Yet every challenge had shaped them. Every disappointment had taught patience. Every mistake had become an opportunity to grow wiser. Every difficult season had strengthened their character. Looking back, they realized that none of those experiences had been wasted. Each one had prepared them to build a healthier, kinder, and more respectful future. Don't skip this part, because this is the greatest lesson of the entire fictional story. They discovered that meaningful relationships are not held together by perfect timing or dramatic promises. They are strengthened through ordinary acts of faithfulness. Through listening without interrupting. Through speaking with honesty instead of anger. Through forgiving when forgiveness feels difficult. Through showing respect even during disagreement. Through choosing kindness again and again, even on ordinary days when no one else is watching. Those simple choices became stronger than fear had ever been. One peaceful evening, as the sun slowly disappeared below the horizon, they stood together in comfortable silence. This silence was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with understanding. They smiled, remembering how close they had once come to walking away forever. If fear had won, they would have carried unanswered questions for the rest of their lives. Instead, they had chosen courage. They had chosen conversation. They had chosen growth. That decision changed not only their relationship but also the people they had become. They understood that true peace is not found in a life without challenges. It is found in hearts willing to face every challenge together with humility, patience, and compassion. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story leaves behind one final truth. Every ending carries within it the possibility of a beautiful new beginning. Every setback contains a lesson waiting to be discovered. Every difficult conversation can become the first step toward healing when spoken with honesty and kindness. No one can rewrite yesterday, but everyone can choose how they will live today. Those daily choices become the story that tomorrow remembers. As dawn broke across the horizon one final time, the sky filled with brilliant shades of gold, blue, and crimson. The two travelers stepped forward with peaceful hearts, no longer carrying the weight of regret or fear. They carried gratitude for every lesson, wisdom earned through every challenge, and hope that continued shining brighter with every sunrise. They understood that life would still bring unexpected seasons, but they were no longer afraid of them. Whatever tomorrow held, they would face it with integrity, respect, patience, and unwavering compassion. My beloved child, remember this as the story comes to its close. The greatest miracle was never that someone stayed. The greatest miracle was that both people allowed their hearts to grow. They learned to communicate with honesty, forgive with sincerity, and love with humility. That transformation became the true happy ending. And as they walked together into the light of a brand new morning, leaving behind fear, pride, and silence forever, they realized that every chapter, even the painful ones, had been leading them toward a future filled with peace, purpose, and hope. The sun rose higher, the path stretched before them, and they walked forward with quiet smiles, knowing that this was not the end of their journey but the beginning of a wiser and brighter life. Their story ended not with fear or loss, but with renewed trust, lasting friendship, and the courage to face whatever came next, together, one faithful step at a time.